Hello, greetings, good afternoon, good morning, is it still morning? I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm going to launch in because the medium is the message. I'm going to tell my family story. My grandparents came from Spain. They were laborers in the Basque mines owned by the English. And they were taught to read in the socialist schools that the socialists set up in the mines, and became empowered activists and very troublesome to the Spanish government, and they had to get out. So they went to Mexico, yay, a Spanish-speaking country, in 1907, and just in time for the onset of the Mexican Revolution, which, as we know from the Latino Americans film series, brought many people over the border into California. So after a few years in Mexico, they moved over the border into California where it was safer. And the result of this is that my uncle was born in Spain, my aunt in Mexico, and my father in California. So I come from a long line of undocumented people because my aunt and uncle's birth certificates were destroyed in a courtroom fire. That was the story that they had to live with their life. This personal history recaps in condensed form the 140 years that preceded it when the Spanish arrived in California. Not Spanish in our modern sense, but Spanish-speaking. They were definitely not Gachupines from Spain. They were people who arrived in this country. And the historic site in Fruitvale, how many here have seen Fruitvale Station, the movie? Yeah? That is a movie about a black youth that was killed by a rapid transit policeman. And that's all most people know about Fruitvale, but it is the district in Oakland with the highest percentage of Latinos, almost 68% Latino now. And in the middle of that, by historical chance, there is this historic site which recaps or encapsulates the Spanish and Mexican periods of California. It was the headquarters of a 45,000 acre rancho, land granted in the Spanish period, with a footprint of the 1821 and 1840 adobe from the Mexican period. And so it really is a site that encapsulates that whole history. But the most important thing to me, and today what I'm going to talk about, is the fact that it is one of the most diverse communities in the United States today. It's not only Latino, although they are predominant. It has one of the highest concentrations of Native American urban populations, a huge Southeast Asian and Asian population, and a very large African American population, and that is part of our mission. And this project, I just want to put that out there, it isn't about exalting Latino Americans above others. It's about sharing among all these people who are here today. Our latest influx is, for instance, people from Yemen. And we see now in the historic core of the park, beside the footprints of the adobes, women in full burqa playing soccer with their kids. So when I arrived at Peralta Hacienda, there was an old house and a sort of empty field beside it. But it was a really important, our theme that we all are speaking of is one of lost history. This knowledge of this history had been lost to the modern world and needed to be made visible. So I came on as ED in 1999, and I'm going to sort of go through what we did as along with this theme of grassroots outreach. So the first thing we did, it's had a big community meeting with 50 people, and the vision generated then is blow by blow what we are still implementing and have been implementing for the last 16 years. Then I interviewed 20 community leaders, and that's a huge part of grassroots outreach, is interviewing community leaders. And that formed the basis of a successful NEH planning grant to create the interpretive plan and the landscape plan for the site. which again, those plans and physical and interpretive have been what we've been fulfilling ever since in many ways that I'm talking about now. But simultaneously, I began a project called Faces of Fruitvale, and some of the panels from it are lined up just back of the chairs, and it was suggested that we move them into the brainstorm area later. These are community stories, and in these community stories, it was a giant project, and if I'd known what I'd known now, I might not have made it so enormous. And all the big themes of the Latino Americans' films, well, I shouldn't say all, but many of them, especially in the Mexican American history, are reflected. The Mexican Revolution that brought my grandparents and many other people across the border, the Bracero program, the farm workers movement, and Cesar Chavez. As Rita Torres, one of the interviewees, said, when Luis Valdez stood up in one of the performances of Teatro Campesino and said, "Yo soy el sol," she said, at that moment, her identity as a Chicana was born, and she thought, I'm a Chicana, and I am going to save the world. And so those are the stories we get. So people are telling the history. We aren't telling them, they're telling us. And then there's also stories of the experiences and lives of undocumented people. So this big oral history exhibit, what I want to say, my main message in this speech, so to speak, is that outreach is the same as local history. That when you reach out and do an oral history project and gather people's stories, you've been reaching out and you've been building the relationship with your institution. You know, like an oral history project about the undocumented day laborers, the jornaleros that are in Fruitvale, is part of our Latino Americans project. So there was, when the historic house, fully restored like a little chocolate box Victorian, opened, filled with community faces, there was somewhat of a mixed reaction. Like, what are these people doing in the historic house? But we all just were so happy because we sent the message to the community that you are part of history. Every human being makes history, whether they know it or not. So I'm an advocate for oral history projects and exhibits. So rather than preserve Latino culture exclusively, we see all of history as the layering of many histories into the present, and each culture in its big themes and issues over time echoes the others. So we went on to create permanent historical exhibits about the Peraltas, layered with the Native American interaction. And then those were our so-called permanent historical exhibits. And then we began a series of community exhibits on topics that community groups generated and that we facilitated. And I see this still broadly in the context of outreach, because when you do the projects, you have to reach out to people, and you end up communicating with them in a very deep way. I'll give just one example. We did a project with Oakland's Cambodian community, which is only 3,000 or so people, but it was about recovery from the trauma of the Pol Pot era through the recovery of classical Khmer music in the Cambodian community today. And so this sounds like, a very recherché topic, and we had an advisor, a scholarly advisor, who was wonderful to work with, Katria of UC Berkeley. But the issue of trauma and its aftermath, I mean, which of us in this room hasn't experienced trauma and recovered from it and had to find a way, or knows and loves someone who has had that experience? So that was the core that made that small exhibit focused on Cambodian Americans in Oakland a universal message. And now we're about to embark on the building of the historic core through an NEH Challenge grant to, we hope, unfold the true history of the West in terms of its Latino heritage. But the crowning construction in the historic core, right next to the 1821 adobe representation, is a pavilion of California cultures, which will be an outdoor museum without walls, where a continuing parade of community stories will be told. And that will keep us honest, it will keep us in contact and reaching out. I am disorganized in that I did not put on each of your chairs a questionnaire that I had wanted to share with you, where I was going to get from you your ideas, your own. I was really interested in your own personal histories. I'm a sort of addict to hear family histories, and I wanted little encapsulations because I'm really curious what in your background might have impelled you to do the work you do. And then the next questions on my questionnaire are: who is in your community? What are their needs? And what are the stories that they want to tell? And I would really love to get feedback on that. You've got my email, and I would love to have yours. There's a space for that on my questionnaire. But another thing that I have, and I'll put it on the table so you can grab it if you go, when you go out. I recommend you fill in a sort of strategic planning chart about your community. I mean, many of you may be in affluent communities or downtowns without many residential people, but it still pertains. Make it your own, change it, do with it what you would like, and do it with community members. And it has things like, you know, community needs in our community. One is ESL classes. So what's that to do with our mission? And how can that mission be interwoven with this strong community need that has economic and cultural ramifications? Remember, your nonprofit can't solve everything, but you can see by such a diagram which community issues you can effectively and appropriately tackle. And you know, grassroots outreach, I am an exponent of Rules for Radicals, the Saul Alinsky community organizing techniques. You know, imagine going door to door, knocking on the door of someone you don't know, and telling them about Peralta Hacienda Historical Park. But I cannot emphasize how unbelievably rewarding and fruitful that has been. So please buy Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, and you know, I share with him the idea that every human story is worth telling. And when we did the Faces of Fruitvale exhibit, we didn't have a criterion that some stories we would put in the exhibit and others not. Everyone who came forward, their story was included. And that was really an interesting discipline, and again, the results I am was so happy with. But you know, all of us know we try to do too much, and so you know, guard against that as well. You know, one of the real questions we've asked ourselves at Peralta Hacienda Historical Park is, do we need a social worker on staff? Because we have gang members, we have drug dealers, we have homeless in the park daily, and we do need a social worker, but it's really hard to convince funders that a historic site needs a social worker, even in Fruitvale. But we do know that the effects of arts and history and storytelling is really indisputably and measurably very, very strong. So one of the other questions on the questionnaire, I really hope you'll pick it up, is about the activities that you have tried, because you know, we here on the panel don't have all the ideas. We are bouncing off each other, people like you. So just a show of hands, how many here have done exhibits or activities featuring oral history with first-person local stories? Yeah, that's great. That's great. Yeah, and I encourage everyone who hasn't to do it. It is the most powerful form of outreach. The magic of sharing your story really changes the relationship of the storyteller to the recipient, and of the community to the nonprofit who holds the stories thereafter in trust. This is people leaving their mark on the historical record. Many of us are echoing the same ideas, giving voice to the voiceless. And this is really, intimations of immortality. It's very, very powerful. Leslie has saved me time, because one of the, I was going to talk about particulars about panels. And the only thing I would add is that we've really specialized in having community members and not the usual suspects on our panels, with the moderator also sharing his story. The moderator may be, I shouldn't have said his or hers, his or her story alongside the community members, so that isn't some weird hierarchical thing. But everything else that Leslie said, it was so useful and so well laid out. I really appreciate it. One of the debacles that we had at the beginning, we thought, edgy topics, yes, these things need to come out. So we had a dialogue between Native Americans and Spanish landowning families, descendants. But it really erupted into a very, very painful, volatile situation out of our control. And people were insulted. Native American tribes were insulting each other, and other really lamentable things like that. So we learned the hard way. We thought a lot. And the other two events we've had have been really, really successful. And but there's a lot to learn. So take everything Leslie said to heart, because it was so useful. We're going to have in the Latino project, Latino Americans project, a panel in collaboration with the African American Museum and Library of Oakland. They didn't get funded, they're so sad, but we're gonna do a program that they were planning about the conflict and communication and positive aspects between African Americans and Latinos. So quickly, a couple of other things that we do is story circles on a more informal basis with even children, like with bricks with the letters STORYCIRCLES in the middle, and people tell their stories. But that also really needs to be moderated and prepared, because a story circle can be like a psychiatrist's couch. And people can say things that they wish they hadn't said. So we now know, frame it. You don't have to say anything that you don't want to say, and you can say anything you do want to say in this event. Food events, food is a great jumping off place for stories. And just one quick word about festivals. I don't know how many of you are planning festivals, but really convene 4 or 5 relevant organizations now, 1 year ahead. We've done this for 5 years now with the Cambodian community, and every year it gets better. And all the energy we put into those many, many meetings with collaborators is just pays off in the end, and without that we couldn't do it. We also have a program that was funded by the IMLS to integrate community members into the museum staff as fully trained historical docents. People right in the surrounding area, which is surrounded by the most severely distressed census tracts from the census category. So really disadvantaged economically, educationally people, but it's been an incredible adventure to teach and give this history. And it means so much. It's bilingual in English and Spanish, and the Spanish-speaking docents are just unbelievably proud of this museum now, and that they are docents in the museum. And it's still developing how to do it as well as we would like to, but it's been, again, a very satisfying journey. Ernesto's quote, one of the docents, he said in his evaluation, he said, "This was once Mexico, but it isn't any longer." And I thought that was an eloquent way of stating the viewpoint of many of the people in the community. And then I'm going to end this sort of recitation of possible activities with something we've tried a little bit and are going to try again for the Latino Americans Project. which is really part of community outreach, grassroots outreach, community walks. So you pick a spot, and maybe a spot about a mile away, and you choose a series of stations, and they can be houses, architectural details, stores, groceries, for instance. For instance, in Fruitvale, there's many Western gear stores, and many people outside the community don't know about this incredible ranching and horsemanship tradition in Mexico, and how big a part it is for the identity of many Mexicans in the West, and how much it's contributed to our American cowboy tradition. And so that Western gear store, with its $5,000 beautiful works of art cowboy hats, which are under glass, it's like an exhibit, will be a revelation to many people who come on the community walks. And the good thing about this is that, you know, it can bring people into the community who are afraid to come into a Latino district, because it gives them a curated, safe way to come in and learn. And then they see, wow, this is really neat. I'm going to come back here and eat. Oh, this is a cool store. I want a cowboy hat too. And so the community walk can be a really, really great thing. We're going to collaborate with the Oakland Heritage Alliance and Alex Zaragoza of UC Berkeley, who's our main academic advisor, and a colleague of David, I think. So outreach methods, you know, who are you trying to reach, and what media do they use? We know from experience that calendar listings in normal print media, no one in the community reads that. The larger outreach area of the whole metropolitan area, yes, and so we do that too. But for the immediate community, we have to have door-to-door and flyering. It's really, and bilingual, of course, so it's really, really important. You know, my finale is that grassroots outreach really reveals and illuminates local history. So the act of reaching out, you accumulate and collect and reveal and illuminate local history, because if you reach out and then prepare exhibits and dignify people with presenting their voice in many media in many ways, that is outreach. And it's really moving into the broader picture. You know, it's about democracy. You know, how to give a voice to those who are rarely heard in the public sphere, but who have everything to offer and who have what we need. We have to know, for instance, from people that were sharing the streets and schools and stores, not only about their lives, but about the wisdom in their cultures. The Native Americans' relationship to the natural world, the relationship of a Laotian hill tribe to the natural world. These are things that we need for the survival of our planet. And it's about, here in America, welcoming people, bringing out the best in them, acknowledging their sufferings and pain, as well as skills, wisdom, traditions, and their pride in who they are. And understanding their belief systems, placing these beliefs in the interwoven history of the world. You know, there's an example from early California history. The Peraltas had 8,000 longhorns right, you know, a few miles from here in the East Bay, and 2,000 horses. And I think about that longhorn and the Spanish soldier, who was a, you know, penniless soldier in the occupational force. And that was a symbol, that longhorn, of the hierarchy that he was a part of that led in these layers up to the king of Spain and, of course, even God beyond that. And then the Native American who saw the same longhorn, and there was an animal wandering on his or her people's ancestral grasslands. And the tragic consequences we live with today, in that the Native American population, for many reasons, not just the punitive measures of the Spanish occupational force, but also the unintentional importation of disease-bearing microbes, we have lost so much of the Native American heritage that might have been woven into our society today. And so, you know, I think that they needed a Latino Americans project. They needed some translators. They needed some wise historical types who could help people tell each other, that Spanish soldier and the Native American, where they were coming from and what they were all about, and figure out some ways that they could live together, knowing each other's stories. And I don't mean that trivially. I mean that as a real example, that if only those steps that we are, and I love the word courage that Leslie used, that we are courageously, and in some respects, I would say heroically doing, really makes our country, despite the pain and the mess, the dynamic complications and the recent news, is doing better than almost any country in the world is of living together in diversity. And so I really urge you to go forth and make your interpretive exhibits, collect community stories, and get those scholars in there swinging, and we'll all be better for it in the decades to come.
Thank you so much.